We've been hearing a lot lately about unity. Democrats and Republicans argue about how unity can be achieved and whose fault it is that we have so much polarization in the first place. But is polarization intrinsically bad? Is unity intrinsically good? No and no. Polarization isn't good or bad in itself. What we need to do is depolarize along culture war lines and repolarize along class lines. Democratic messaging lately has been all about unity. Joe Biden said, he really said this, I'm not making it up, that achieving bipartisan unity was going to be as important to him as ending slavery was to Abraham Lincoln.
On New Year's Day in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. When he put pen to paper, the president said, and I quote, "If my name ever goes down into history, it'll be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." Today, on this January day, my whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people, uniting our nation.
That's pretty extreme, but the basic idea that polarization is bad for us is everywhere in American political discourse. The implicit model of political debate underlying most polemics against polarization goes something like this. Politics is about problems. Political differences arise when different factions coalesce around different proposed solutions to those problems. Polarization is bad, according to this view, because when we see each other as enemies, we become too divided from one another to agree on the best solutions. There are two basic problems with this problem-solving picture of political disagreement. We can call them the Humean objection and the Marxist objection. The Humean objection is that not everyone has the same ideological goals. The problem-solving model of politics assumes that we're all trying to solve the same problems. So the only reason we come to different conclusions about what should happen is that we're making different predictions about how various policies proposals will work out. But as the philosopher David Hume argued, there's a gap between facts and values. Judgments about what's right or wrong, good or bad, or what anyone should or shouldn't do never rest on exclusively factual assumptions. There are always underlying should premises. To see how this works, think about the demand for a $15 minimum wage. Critics claim that this would lead to more unemployment, and the debate often gets bogged down in the question of whether or not this is true. For the record, current empirical evidence suggests that no, it's not. But even if it could be conclusively proven that a federally mandated $15 minimum wage would trigger, say, a 3% spike in unemployment, mostly because of smaller firms with lower profit margins shutting their doors, this wouldn't end the debate. Leftists like me would continue to advocate a $15 minimum wage. We'd just make sure to mention, in the same breath, the long-standing left-wing demand for a federal jobs guarantee. The pairing of these two demands would hardly be enough to bring around right-wingers or even liberal centrists. Why not? Well, the growth of the public sector at the expense of the private sector would be ideologically congenial to those of us on the socialist left and ideologically abhorrent to them. They would care more about the right of small business owners to stay in business, while we would care more about the right of workers to make a living wage. The conflict would continue, in other words, not because of different judgments about the empirical facts, but because of different goals. And that brings us to the Marxist objection. Not only are we not all on the same team in terms of our normative preferences, we aren't even on the same team in terms of our material interests. Every extra dollar that goes into workers' wages doesn't go into business owners' profits. So if heightened polarization means that the working class majority is increasingly committed to goals like a $15 minimum wage and a federal jobs guarantee, and increasingly angry at the business interests that stand in the way of those goals, that's a good thing, at least from the perspective of anyone who cares about workers' interests. Seeing the Chamber of Commerce as the enemy for standing in the way of those goals is just clarity. So the reasons given by mainstream commentators for thinking that political polarization is intrinsically bad don't make sense. But does that mean that polarization is intrinsically good? Absolutely not. Too often, the political system pits people in different regions and with different cultural backgrounds and media diets against one another rather than against economic elites. That's a very bad thing if you care about workers' interests. In saying this, I don't mean to minimize the so-called social issues that are commonly associated with these battles. The struggles for progressive social policies are vitally important. The problem with the culture wars is that they so often turn fights that should be about institutional policies into fights about individual behavior. For example, instead of arguing about whether the federal government should pay people to stay home during the pandemic, we end up arguing about the morality of individual mask wearing, denouncing COVIDiots, and hailing our commitment to science. Instead of demanding that universities shut down in-person instruction and positioning administrations that fail to do that as the enemy, students who take pandemic safety seriously end up ratting out students who violate social distancing protocols to those same administrations. Another reason that culture war battles are less favorable ground for the left than battles over economic interests is simple arithmetic. The vast majority of society would benefit from left-wing policy proposals. Now, that doesn't guarantee that the vast majority will support them, of course, but it does make the task of winning majority support much easier. Look at Florida, where Trump beat Biden last November, but a ballot resolution for a $15 minimum wage won by more than Trump did. I won't claim to have any easy answers about how to depolarize American politics along culture war lines and repolarize along class war lines. And I don't want anyone to underestimate the difficulty of that task. It's not enough to convince people their interests will be served by left-wing economic policies, which is often a difficult task in itself in a world awash with misinformation and propaganda about how those policies would play out. To convince the vast majority of the population that we would need to mobilize to prioritize a struggle to achieve those redistributive goals over culture war distractions, we also need to engage in the much more difficult task of showing that these goals are realistically achievable and that we can achieve them through common struggle. This is an enormous undertaking. But as steep as this path may be, it's the only one that can get us where we need to go.